everyone, it's David Bombal coming to you from Oxford in the United Kingdom, and I'm really excited to start 2019 with an interview with Eric. I've actually got his books here. Eric is the author of these books. I don't know if you can see that. I've got the first edition and the second edition Mastering Python Networking books. So Eric, welcome to the call. It's really great to have you. We've been trying to do this for a long time. We had a lot of technical issues while I was in Africa. But again, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, it's great to be here. I've been a fan of your channel for a long time.
Thanks.
I think, like I said, I'm always being impressed with how often you produce quality material. I mean, anybody could write, things that on the blog or whatever on a weekly basis, but it takes time and effort to actually produce something of quality. And I think the evidence is pretty self-explanatory just from the feedback that you get from the user. So I've always been impressed, and good to be here. I'm very excited.
Thanks. It's very kind of you. That's brilliant. Right. So Eric, without any further ado, tell us a bit about yourself. So like who you are, where you're based, kind of your experience, and then we'll talk about your book, because I'd really like to get your input about, the future and your book.
Oh yeah, so for me, I've been a network engineer, like in the true sense of network engineering, dealing with routers and switches for the majority of my career. I started working back in 2000, and really just over the years do all kinds of roles, pre-sale, post-sale, service provider, enterprise. And I guess, a lot of your audience is Cisco focused. So I'll mention it here as well. I got my CCIE back in 2008. So had it not expired on me, it would have been 10 years. Last year, just recently passed. But so routing and switching, and I've also worked in. I guess the most relevant experience for our discussion would be for like public cloud providers. So I was ex-Microsoft, ex-AWS. So and I'm based out of Seattle, Washington.
Yeah. So I mean, when we were discussing about this call, you told me you've worked at AWS, you've worked at Microsoft, is that right?
Yep,
and other large companies. So you've had a lot of experience on like the cloud and very large companies.
Yeah, so I think that really what kind of sets me apart. I mean, obviously, just because of the locale, we got two big cloud providers. Seattle is literally, knows the cloud, right? It has both in the natural sense as well as the technical sense. So that was quite interesting experience. I mean, I think we'll discuss it in a bit, but that really was the time where I started to look at Python and, how to survive these large environment. It really opened my eyes about what does it mean to have scale? What does it mean to, be prepared for, the next step out? How to solve a problem that's not seen in a textbook, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so just for people who don't know, because the audience we have is different skill levels. When you talk about Microsoft, you're talking about Azure, is that right?
Yeah, so I mean, anybody who has worked in big companies know the reorganization is kind of the normal way of life, and especially at Microsoft. So I think what I started working was with this group that handles all the infrastructure for Microsoft data centers, and so that includes data center in the sense of buying land, building power, and acquiring systems, servers, but also at the same time doing networking. So that group has divided into different teams, and when I joined Microsoft, I was in the team that supports what this is public information, by the way. That's this team called Autopilot, and this Autopilot team was actually, as you could tell by the name, was try to do everything automated, and eventually that team was merged into Azure group, and back then it was codenamed like Red Dog, and then eventually evolved into Azure. And as it stands right now, and like I said, I think this is all public information, that Azure is now the de facto infrastructure group for all of Microsoft, right? Like Office 365, Xbox Online, and so on and so forth. So it was through different iterations, but it's always kind of this networking sense group for data centers for Microsoft. And you also mentioned AWS. So AWS has always, I mean, Amazon has always been, one infrastructure group. So I've always been in that group. But of course, in this today's sense of world, there's always kind of, focus and there's technical focus. So I was in the team where we first built out CloudFront, of course, data centers. I was in fulfillment center for a little bit, and also telecom. So Amazon was one of the first companies to have large deployment for SIP-based call center, and this was all eventually evolved into a service. It escaped me at the time. I believe it's called AWS Connect, but and not to be confused with Direct Connect, right? But eventually they opened that service up, and that's kind of the MO for AWS. Is something they use internally, and it's all just internal APIs, and then they put slap on the public API and make it an AWS service. So so that kind of give you a sense of kind of the things that things I've done with AWS and Microsoft.
Yeah, I mean, it's really nice because I think for most people watching this, they are in an enterprise or perhaps even small, medium businesses. And it's really nice to have someone, tell us a bit about working on the inside of the cloud, because not everyone gets that opportunity. So
yeah, I think.
Go on.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so I think one of the running joke that we used to have at AWS was at Amazon and AWS was that we'll just put it in the cloud, right? Because we'll put it in S3. It's kind of this what is it called? Like this contradicting feedback loop, right? Because it's the cloud for everybody else, but it's cabling, power, switches, servers, all these other stuff that it's the cloud for everybody else. But for us, it's very real. It's like we got to scale this thing to meet customer demand. And how do we do it? But I do find it that, because I've worked in enterprise as well. I've worked in service providers and enterprise. So I do find it kind of polarizing. So people in enterprise simply don't have the scaling problem of these public clouds. But at the same time, the public clouds live in a bubble where they see everything through this bubble where, Facebooks and Google, and there's only a selected few companies that have these challenges. So then I see this polarization for network engineering, especially, that people with enterprise are just overwhelmed with the amount of technologies that coming at them, but they need to know a little bit of everything, where the public cloud needs to go super deep in. I mean, I have friends who file patents for cable management, right? And I have friends who have filed patents for just like how do we get top of road down into in a short amount of distance, not to exceed capacity to the end of road, the kind of thing. So I see this just polarization. The day we live in is just amazing. It's so different than when I first started, and maybe when you first started as well.
Oh yeah, I mean I'm glad you started talking about that, because I was going to ask you, what's the difference between like your experience on the enterprise side and on the cloud side? And I think what you've said, correct me if I'm wrong, is enterprise today, very broad. Cloud, you're very, very narrow on a specific topic, but scale.
Yeah, that's in general, that's a very good summarization. I think, at least in my personal view, right? So majority of my career has been on large scale data center clouds, but in my brief exposure to enterprise, and I mean, I think it would be great to hear, from your audience on some of the comments or just the kind of challenges that people has been through, because we all could learn a lot from each other, right? I think in that sense it's a very true.
Oh, definitely. So, I mean, you got your CCIE about 10 years ago, is that right?
Yeah.
Routing and switching, yeah?
Routing and switching, right. I mean, I think I eventually tried to go for voice, but at the time, Cisco had some proprietary protocols and they were not fully embracing SIP, but I was doing SIP mostly at the time. And so, I mean, I'm a big fan of voice over IP. I actually, if you check out my LinkedIn page, I actually have 2 patents on voice over IP.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they all belong to Amazon, but but yeah. So I was just to show evidence that I was a big fan of that, right? But yeah, but then I kind of deviated myself away from Cisco, and unfortunately my CCIE expired after like 5 years. I think I renewed it once, but yeah, I know you're paying. If you're going through CCIE and this certification track, I know you're paying. Hanging there, the light is at the end of the tunnel, and I applaud your effort, because you don't have to do it, but people who choose down this path is really trying to grow themselves voluntarily. So I applaud your path.
No, I agree. So what I was going to ask you is, you started like a typical network engineer, for lack of a better term,
Right.
like routing and
Right.
switching, traditional stuff. But you've kind of pivoted, if you like, or moved more and more into network automation, Python, it, DevOps, or, whatever term. And it would be interesting to hear what you call it, whatever term we want to call it today. So when did you make that change from traditional CLI junkie, for lack of a better word, the
Sure.
CLI guy, to like
Yeah.
automation, and how
Right.
did that happen?
Well, I like to say that I have the foresight about 10 years ago, but I really didn't. It was really just by accident, really. It was just a force by the job requirement, really. So if you imagine, in the enterprise world, maybe you build a few data centers a year, and each data center maybe have, I don't know, 100 racks, right? Give or take. But so that is still manageable manually. I mean, it's not easy to get into each devices and so on and so forth. If you think about, like the typical 48 servers per rack and top of rack switch, and you aggregate them into AGs and core. So it's doable. It's not easy. It's doable. But if you multiply that by, I don't know, 5x, and then you have to do that every 2 weeks, then that's what the skills at the public cloud, right? And or I don't want to just say public cloud, but so is I guess Netflix uses AWS as a backend, so maybe like Facebook, right? Facebook, Google, back then Yahoo, Verizon, whatever it is, that all these companies have very various degree, but they all just struggle to meet the demands. And so I think it's really getting into it was really just a way for us to survive. I'll tell you a story. When I first joined AWS, I was in a group and working alongside with many, many other groups. It's called Tier 1 services. So I work with all the Tier 1 services owners. And there was one time we were troubleshooting. This was like 6 months into the job. And this was one time we were both troubleshooting an issue that impacts both of us. And I was just looking through logs. I was looking through configuration. And for a few hours, we couldn't figure it out. And eventually, the guy, wrote some Perl script, and then he went home. 5:30, he went home. It's like, oh, it's not my issue. And clearly, it wasn't his issue. And I was there for 4 hours. And at the end of the fourth hour, I talked to myself as I got to get some of that Perl magic, right? I mean, I wanted to go home at 5:30 too. But how did he get, so much done? We look at the same amount of logs. We look at the same amount of equivalent same amount of lines. And how do you get done in 30 minutes? And I'm here 4 hours later, still troubleshooting and trying to figure this out, right? So that was when I started to think about how do we do this and so on. And you mentioned Python, right? So it's not. I've always maintained a stand where that Python is for me, but you don't have to do Python, right? Just whatever tool that you choose. And in this case, the guy was using Perl, so that's great. But for me, the Python language just fits my brain, how my brain thinks. So, I've had exposure to Java and Perl and some of the other languages, but the way that Python was structured just fits my brain a little bit better. So for people, I think for traditional networking, as you mentioned, David, that who's been dealing with CLI, one of the first questions they face is usually what language to pick. And I would say give Python a shot, but if it's really just not your cup of tea, don't worry about it. Go try something else. As long as it gets the job done, I think that's fine.
I think you've hit it on the head there. It doesn't help to get, I don't know what the right term is, but get all mad about a specific language.
Yeah.
Like this is the
No
language.
language war here.
Sorry?
Yeah. I said no language war here, right? Like
Yeah,
there's
exactly.
no debate on Python's more superior, or I think there's a right tool for the job. I think a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, but nowadays I see Go coming up
Yeah,
a
I was going to
lot.
ask you about Go.
Yeah, and that's great, right? Go is very quick, and Go is very has certain advantages. I'm not a Go pro. I guess Go Lang pro,
Yeah.
but I heard a lot of great things about it. So if you like Go for it. For me, because on my day job, so besides the Python book, I also wrote a distributed denial of service book for O'Reilly. So that is actually my day job. So that actually veers into a lot with data science, analytics, and aggregating large amount of data into kind of actionable insights. So Python actually veers great into that area as well. So I'm sticking with Python, but I see Go being a lot of the guys are fans of Go, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that because, I mean, for a long time, I've been saying learn Python. It's easy to get started. There's a lot of free stuff out there, a lot of the Cisco stuff. And I use Cisco because I think most guys work with Cisco.
Sure.
Cisco works well with Python. But it's interesting that you mentioned Go. So if someone was learning a language today, like this is their first language, you'd still recommend Python. Is that right?
I would, but I have a bias toward Python.
No, that's fine. It's just based on your experience. I mean, you're a CCIE, you've got all this experience, you're working on crazy large networks. It's great to get your opinion, and I would agree with you. Python makes it easy. So it's like we said, don't get into a war about a language, but you got to start somewhere.
Exactly. And I'm going to steal Michael Kennedy, the host of Talk Python to Me's a quote here. So I think there are multiple times if you listen to his podcast and his guests, right? So it seems like there's a trend going that you could start small in Python. I mean, it's a language that easily gets started, like you said. But for perhaps some of the other languages that are easy to get started, you hit that ceiling where you go to a certain level and then what, right? You're twiddling your thumb and it's like, okay, so it's slow and there's no way to speed it up. So now you have to go and pick something else, maybe something that's binary, that compiled before you actually execute whatever it is, right? But Python doesn't have that ceiling. Like once you learn it, then you could go into say web development, for sure, Django, Flask. You could go into data science. There's actually dedicated conferences for data scientists using Python and called PyData. And you could also go into DevOps, like what we've done, right? You could write Ansible modules, and there's Python hooks for most of the framework that you could think of, Chef, Puppet, and so on. So I think that ceiling, I mean, at least for me, I guess this is 5, 6, 7 years later, I still haven't found that ceiling, which is great, right? Yeah. That's a great protection for your time investment. And like I said, and as you alluded to, David, that if you tried it, it's not your cup of tea, don't worry about it. You're already a better network engineer. You're already a better DevOps engineer by learning a little bit of Python and move on to Go or stick with Perl, Haskell, whatever.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you, like in your job,
yeah,
could you do your day-to-day job without Python or without network automation? Or are you saying it's kind of impossible?
Yeah, it's impossible. So right now we do a lot of our work with both in our own hosted environment as well as, so I work for A10 Network, so shout out to A10 peeps out there. But as far as automation, as far as managing our own network, managing our own infrastructure, there's just no way that, not a day goes by where I don't hit up a terminal, whether to look at code, write some code, or just review other people's code. And in today's world, even in the most basic sense for AWS, that you only do the most basic things in the console. Everything else is through APIs or Boto, their Python SDK, and so on. And same thing for Azure.
So you would recommend, like an engineer, if they're starting out, let's say they want to, they're not quite sure, because I get this question a lot. Like, should I study CCNA? Should I study Python? Should I study CCNP? Should I study Python? Is there a future for network engineers? That kind of thing. What would you say?
I would say get small wins. Like for me, it's always small wins and gradually. I think you've mentioned it in your YouTube videos and podcasts and writing as well. Is this stretch goal, right? A deliberate practice where you kind of learn the thing that stretches your limit just a little bit, right? Not impossible because you would just give up, and not so easy that you could do in your sleep, then it's not challenging enough. So stretch goal. And I think if you match that stretch goal approach with small wins on your job, then you get rewarded right away. So going back to the question that we take is that, learn CCNA, learn Python, go for CCNP, so on and so forth, is just to match up your job. If your job is heavily, say you work for a reseller, of course, go as far as you could. You actually get benefits for like actual dollar discounts from Cisco by being a CCNP, by being a CCNA. You bring actual value to an employer by, getting these certs and so on. So I think it's up to you. I think only you could answer that. But I would say focus on getting small wins, stretch practice, and getting rewarded. So for me, in my own personal experience, the certification just doesn't offer value to my employer, and I'm not getting rewarded. In fact, when I received my CCIE, I think I got like $100 bonus from my manager. It's a pat on the back, but after years of studying, hours of labbing, that doesn't even cover my lab costs, right? But that's okay. That's my personal satisfaction, and I've got that box to check off. But it would have been nice had it been, a reseller, and you actually get dollar discount. You could negotiate for maybe a better title or whatnot. But so I'm sorry, I'm deviating away from the question.
No, it's great. Go for it.
So I think the answer for me is only you can answer that, but focus on stretch goals, focus on small rewards, and of course, you and I both agree that networking fundamental is a must, right?
Yeah.
Like you got to learn about ARPing, you got to learn about, like, doesn't really matter what you go into, but networking, even if you do, because I was just making some changes to our Direct Connect yesterday, and without some of the fundamental networking knowledge, I could not have get it done, or it would have taken me a lot longer to do. So routing is obviously important. Even for Direct Connect and VPN, all the cloud providers are recommending BGP. So arguably it's even more important, right? Because with all these vast majority of technologies that deviate and specialize, you have to normalize on fundamentals. You have to normalize on TCP/IP. You have to normalize on the protocols. So get the fundamentals down, focus on rewards and doing stretch goals. That'll be my personal recommendation. And it's the same message that I tell my friends. And so I actually mentor some younger engineers in various jobs. So those are the exact words that I tell them. Find the most highest priority in your group, work on those, and then find the skills that interest you to match those goals. And I think you won't be disappointed.
So Eric, sorry, I had a technical problem there. So let me ask you this question. If someone's studying at CCNA level, would you recommend that they first complete their CCNA or start Python straight away? And the same at CCNP. Should they study Python at the same time as CCNP, or should they wait till they get their CCNP before they start with Python? Just, what would you say?
Yeah, so if some person have asked me that question, I would say depending on if the CCNA is taking up 100% of your free time, right? Because if it is, then you got to get I'm also a big believer in getting your rest and getting that margin that you need just to be productive. Don't sacrifice your sleep just for certification, right? So I would ask you, I would actually answer your question with the question that is the CCNA studying taking out 100% of your time, or is it taking up, or can you cut off, some time with watching TV, or maybe you could, shorten up your workout routine and whatnot and still get the most efficient workout that you do, that you could squeeze in some time. If the answer is yes in that question, then you have some additional free time, then go invest in Python, because like I said, it's a good investment of your time. You will be a better network engineer as a result. You will be a better engineer, period, right? Like in today of age, you can't go wrong. So if you have some free time that outside of studying, go for it. Go studying Python. But if not, then stick with CCNA, right? Like I said, focus is very important as well. So focus on CCNA, get that thing out of the way, and then ask yourself, from small wins and deliberate practice, that do you want to spend some time going with Python? And if you don't just take my word for it, go out and do your research, right? Find somebody who you respect as a technical luminary in your field, and follow them on Twitter. And nowadays, look them up on LinkedIn and, read their blog and see what their thoughts are. I think from my research, I mean, I was in the same boat as you. I would look it directly in your eye and say, a couple of years ago, I was in the same boat. I got my CCIE and I was wondering where to go next. Another CCIE or, Python or Ansible, whatever it is. But, and I ended up going for Python just because I look up the industry. I should go try it out. I talked to people, not you, David. I think a couple of years ago, I couldn't.
Generally.
Yeah, but I haven't seen you a couple of years ago. But now, people on your audience, go look at David's channel, look at his past recordings, and if you trust him, and I think a lot of your audience do, then make your own judgment. But take these people's advice, who's been there, and determine your own path.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's really. Python is really important these days. I mean, I'll say it straight because I think Cisco pushing it, it's kind of the market's going that way. It's interesting. I mean, you were forced to learn it. Well, I mean, you saw the advantage. That other chap was able to do his work much quicker than you, so there was like a real incentive to do that. And then in work, in the cloud, you have to do it. But I think for me, it's like this whole thing. Once you've done it, you'll never look back. Because
yeah, I agree.
It's like having I don't know how to say it. It's like walking versus having a Ferrari type thing. Once you get that, it's like, why would you go back to the old way of doing it? I don't know if you agree with that, but that's sort of my take.
Yeah, and I think Cisco started out, if you remember a few years ago, Cisco was really resistant, right? Like they kind of like Microsoft, right? They say open source was cancer, and then they turn around and fully embrace open source. And that's kind of like Cisco with automation. Cisco initially was just like, no, we own it. If you want automation, we got some software, give us a bucket of money and we'll manage it for you. And I like to think that we play some part in that, right? So because of the places we worked at, we have a real purchasing power, and we actually put in the Python requirement. And if you remember the N3K, I mean, that was one of the first platforms that they actually, instead of building their own chipset, they actually go out and bought Broadcom chipsets, and by default they had, Python, anyways. So N3K was the first foray, and we worked closely with Cisco at the time to make it better. And of course, Arista is always there, and Cumulus. So all of these industry movements are moving toward having Python as kind of the de facto common denominator as far as network automation and so on. So all these movements, I think if you go out, and I'm talking to the audience out there, that if you go out and do your own research, you will find that there's so much resources. The ceiling is basically non-existent at this moment, and you'll make you a better engineer. So go for it. Network fundamentals, but after the fundamentals, I would say it's the best investment of your time.
See, here's a hard question because, I mean, you've actually, it's a good example, yeah. You let your CCIE expire, is that right? So
yeah.
So you actually, I've seen some guys say this. They say, should I do Python or should I do CCIE? So that's a different kettle of fish now because, I mean, I agree, CCNA, CCNP, you need fundamentals. You can't, the quickest way to automate, I've said it before, the quickest way to destroy a network, and many guys have said it, is to automate it,
Yeah,
because if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to screw it up badly.
Yeah, you poke yourself in the eye, and just like you poke it like faster, so fast that you can't even blink.
Yeah, so you need to understand what the automation is actually doing. But, so here's a hard question. Would you, if you were starting again today, let's say you just got your CCNP, and you, with your experience and your knowledge, would you go and do a CCIE, or would you go full-blown, automation, Python, whatever?
Yeah, I think you put in the very important context there, David, is that if you were to start today, right? So, you and I both got our CCIE a long time ago, like 10 years ago for me, and probably longer for you. Yeah. But so 10 years ago, it was a different landscape. Like the way to move up the chain was actually to know more Cisco and be, mindful and know these tricks, right? Like how do we get a subnet mask that's, instead of binary, like increments of one? Like how do you construct bit mask that? I mean, these you don't really use in the network. So 10 years ago was a very different landscape, and I decided to go for my CCIE because of what it was. Today is really up in the air, and I'm leaning probably 60% toward Python. or programmability. That's not even say Python, right? It doesn't have to be Python, but programmability. That I would lean toward that 60 or even a little bit higher than that. The only thing that would sway me toward doing CCIE is if I get huge amount of rewards by getting that number, right? Maybe I work for a reseller. Maybe I work for Cisco, and that was the way to move up the chain. So in these cases, I would probably go for CCIE, maybe multiples of them, right? Because those are what's required by the job, and it's still stretched. And also, even if you work for resellers in Cisco, you could still learn Python and get ahead, right? That's not there's no wrong way about doing that, but yeah, so I would say, just to give a simple answer, I would go for Python. If all you have is 90 minutes a day to study and you want to dedicate on something, I would go for Python for majority of the case, unless you get deliberately in your job that you could get benefit from a CCIE. In that case, you're not doing it on your free time. You're spending the company dime on furthering your own skill set. Then that's a different story.
I think it's a great answer. I think that's a really good way to put it. Yeah. So if there's a financial benefit, like you're working for a reseller, it makes a lot of sense. But if you, like in your example, and sorry, Eric, I want to talk about your book.
Yeah, no worries.
But it's so cool to get like your view on all of this stuff. And hopefully we can have a lot of calls, because I want to like pick your brains. If you were working for a AWS, like you mentioned, you guys in AWS, I think you were at AWS at that point. You put pressure on Cisco. So that I mean, the cloud providers have kind of changed the landscape a lot. So in a cloud provider, Cisco gear isn't necessarily always that important. Like Facebook have their own switches and stuff. So is that fair to say that, like especially like in the cloud environment, Python programmability becomes even more important?
Yeah. So I was with Microsoft at the time.
Sorry.
No. So I was with Microsoft, and for sure, right? So it's no secret that these big players have gone closer to upstream. So they're making their own switch. They're like Facebook. In Facebook's case, they actually create their own FBOSS operating system, right? So they're deviating away from these, and all of these are contributing first to what we talked about, the polarization, but also once they kind of trigger down into the Cumulus or the Pika 8s, some of the other vendors who are kind of segregating hardware from software. So in the true sense of merit-based switching, that Cisco is less of an influencer, I would say, right? And then it's reflected in their market share. So in my own opinion, that the landscape has changed, and it's changing even faster. That there's multiple players and it getting more niched, right? So we used to discuss networking as like this monolithic thing, where you're just having the packet pass. But now we should discuss networking in terms of data center, in terms of say storage, in terms of clouds, and so it's getting more specialized. So then you talk about data center switching. Is Cisco still relevant? And you're talking about service provider networking. Is Cisco still there? And you're talking about cloud networking. Then Cisco's basically not there, right? Like, or I'm sorry, very small percentage, right? They just came out with some so Amazon Post or whatever it is, right? Like, so we could go on and on, but at the end of the day, you probably want to get laser focused on the industry you're talking about, and then we could have a much more relevant conversation rather than just treating networking as a monolithic, term of industry.
Great answer. Really good answer. I like that.
Thanks,
so, Eric. I've been holding you off, so I want to talk about your book. How much time we still got?
Yeah, no, I got all day to talk about my book, right? It's a labor of love.
Right. So
I hope you have the time to listen to me.
Oh yeah,
mumbling.
No, definitely. I'm really enjoying this. It's really nice talking to you. It's
thanks.
It's always nice to get different views and experiences, and you've obviously had a lot of experience in different fields, or different like customers, large scale. So it's really nice to get that input. So Eric, I'm going to say I've got both your books here. So I've got
I appreciate that. You actually bought both, so
of course,
appreciate
I
that.
like to I like to read physical books. It's always nice to get a
Nice.
PDF, but it's when I study, it's nice to I prefer the physical. I'm old school, showing my age here.
Oh, me too, me too. I mean, I'll show you right now, right? Like I have a bunch of books here, and I also have my physical book on Elasticsearch. I have Jason's book. I have the Python Essential Reference. So yeah, for sure. Like this half where it's super messy is full of books.
No, I'm the same. I got lots of these. So give us the overview of your book. So like we'll talk about second edition, and then I'd like to ask you about why there's a big change between the two editions. So can you tell us a bit about this book? I did a bit of a overview of it before, but I mean, it's much better if it comes directly from you. So tell us, why you wrote the book, what's it about, sort of why would a network engineer buy this book?
Yeah. So, first of all, again, I appreciate you having me here, David. And I appreciate that podcast you did. I mean, I'm not podcast, the YouTube video that you did about overviewing my book. I think it gave the people who, have only 5 minutes to spare, like a good overview of that book. So that's great. So in my own personal, I guess, journey of writing this book, I've always wanted to write books. The opportunity came a lot earlier than I anticipated, right? I thought I'll retire first before I write this book. But it turns out that the opportunity arrived and I grabbed it. So the reason for the book, if I could summarize in one sentence, is to avoid the mistakes I've made.
That's
Please.
great.
Like there's no point in bang your head on the same wall that I did. Yeah. So I wanted to share with you and say, hey, I tried that route and didn't really work, right? And I poked myself in the eye and stay up till 2 a.m. So no need for you to do that. So what I've tried to do is, what would I say to myself 5 years ago when I first started this journey of doing Python for network engineering? So the book kind of mirrors my path, really, and it kind of what I would think that a network engineer would start with. So you always start with, interacting physically with the device, right? How do I programmatically grab information out of this device? What if I only have SSH access? What if I have API access? So on and so forth. So how do I grab information out of the device? And that basically covered the first few chapters, talk about Paramigo, PXPAT, REST API. And then you move on to Ansible, where it's another abstraction layer to grab information out of the box. But it doesn't really matter what tool you use. At the end of the day, you're always trying to get information out of the box. So that's the first section, and maybe covers the first 5 chapters.
Yeah.
And then you move on into, okay, now I have this information. How do I make more use of it? And then how do I have more insights or have more programmatic way of managing the device, right? So then we talked about the book will cover security, monitoring, visualizing network data, and even building your own API, right? If you normalize on APIs for all of your network devices, but you have these like legacy devices that sitting in the data center that hasn't been upgraded for 5-6 years, you still want to put an API on top of it. It's actually one of my favorite chapters, to writing your own API so that you could abstract that legacy software and appear as a unison to external engines, like whether that be a programmer that you work with, or maybe that would be yourself, or maybe you will be a managing station that talks to your device, right? So that covers maybe chapter, I forgot exactly, but maybe 6 to 9. So monitoring, visualization, and building APIs, and security a little bit, and then you move on and say, okay, now I have all these surrounding services down. How do I make it easier to live with these scripts and these configuration files that I have? So then you move on to say Git, continuous integration, testing, and cloud networking, because like we can't avoid the cloud nowadays. So really just 3 sections. The first section, maybe up to the first 5 chapters, it's just how do I get information out of the device. Second was all these associated services, monitoring, security. And then the third was, I guess you alluded to DevOps. So I would kind of use Hank's term of, NetOps. I think that's what they
DevOps,
use. Net DevOps. Yeah. So I'll probably broadly categorize that. So in a nutshell, that's what I did. And the reason to write is that it's a labor of love. And by the way, yeah. So if you bought the book, and thank you, you're one of the guys who bought the book. All of my proceeds goes to charity. So I actually tracks the charity that I donate to from the book proceeds on my blog. So hold myself accountable for it. But for sure, it's a labor of love, and I'm if anybody finds it useful, if only one person finds it useful, I'm glad for it.
I think that's really important to say. I mean, so all the profits, for whatever the term is, the royalty, should I say, that you get, actually, you don't see that. It goes to a charity. Is that right?
Yeah. So toward the end of the book, obviously, there a lot of people who I respect in the Python community, and Kenneth Rentz, I think is his name. I mean, I'm sorry, Ken, if I forgot your last name, but the guy who wrote the Hitchhiker's Guide to Python, and the author of Request Library, which is super popular. I think you use it too, right?
Yeah.
I've seen it in some of your code. Is that so he wrote that book and donated all of his proceeds from that book to PyGal. And so, so essentially it's an organization who promotes teaching Python to minorities, especially ladies, that so he donates all of his proceeds. And I'm like, hey, if he could do it, I could do it too. So then, of course, my book is probably not nearly as successful as his, but I do my part, right? Yeah. So yeah, and it's also a way for me to pay back for the community, right? So Python Software Foundation, who's been so great at promoting, and some of the organizations I'm involved with, and my tech reviewers for the book, I asked them to designate a charity, and I donated to them. So those are kind of just the ways that I say thank you for people who have helped me.
That's brilliant. That's really brilliant. I mean, it's always nice to hear that, I think we've said this before, you and I, books, if you write a book like this, it's a labor of love, as you said. It's you're not going to get rich off a niche book like this. This is more about giving back. So, I mean, I really appreciate you taking the effort to write this book, Eric. I mean, it's a very good book. So now I've got some questions for you.
Thank you.
First one would be, is there required reading before I take this book? I mean, I kind of said to other guys they should look at perhaps some other books before they look at yours. And I don't know if you agree with that. I mean, can someone who's, say, CCNA just grab your book and start studying?
Probably not. So this was a struggle for me personally to say, at which point should I start, right? Like, it's just such a big and broad subject. So I agree 100% with you, David, that if they could only buy one book, or if they want to start somewhere, get the Jason Edelman and Lowe and Matt Oswald's book, Network Programmability and Automation. It's really nicely done. And by the way, neither of us gets commission from promoting their book,
no,
right?
Not at all. No. I don't make any money off this stuff.
No. So yeah, but it's my honest opinion that, and full disclosure, right? So I was a tech reviewer for that book. So I read the first 50%, and I could tell you, they've actually took the time and modified the first 50% and the rest of the book in accordance with how the industry have evolved. Because I pre-ordered that book back in 2016, right? And that's how long it's been. And I read the first 50% rough draft of that book. And I would tell you, those three guys really put in the time and effort to make changes, to update their content. And it's a huge effort to actually cover the amount of topic that they could cover. They even covered culture, right? The last chapter on that book was, how do you get a automation culture in an organization who's maybe stuck in the mindset of CLI junkie? So it's really a nicely done effort. If you only have one book, if you have time to read one book, like you said, David, go for that book. And then if you I would say it's optional, but go through the Python.org tutorial on just the basics of the language. For second edition, I've actually made sure that all the scripts and so on are work with Python 3. All the libraries and so on are Python 3. So if you so choose to, and for those who doesn't know, that Python has been this transition period with the moving from Python 2 to Python 3, and we'll start calling Python to mean Python 3. And legacy Python to be Python 2. So nowadays, if you're just starting out and if you have time for just learning, just the most crucial stuff, then go for Python 3 and go through the tutorial and then pick up my book. You don't have to read it end to end. Just pick the section that you like, or the big section that will give you the most bang for your work buck. so that you could get that small win. Like again, I think it couldn't be stretched enough to have small wins in your work, because that's when it's a hard path, and you will hit your head, you will get frustrated, and so on. And the only thing that would keep you going is if you could see the reward at the end, whether that's a personal satisfaction, whether that's kind of just getting a raise, getting better promotion, getting that project done, spend more time with your family, whatever it is. The only thing that will get you going is if you have those small rewards. And so that so I would say pick the session that's most useful for you. If you want to learn about like graph, you already have the network information and you just want to graph your topology, or if you want to do some statistics, go straight to the monitoring section or a chapter, and then pick up the scripts that works for you. I try very hard. Like my biggest nightmare for the book would be that somebody would take the book and say, oh, the code doesn't work, right? And so that was my biggest nightmare. So I try very hard. So for the second edition, I actually ran through all the scripts over again on a brand new, Ubuntu installation. So of course I can't say it will work universally. You work on Windows platform, you work on, every single flavor of Linux and, whatever. But I always tell you, for the condition I've set, Ubuntu, Linux, and these library versions, they work. So you don't have to poke yourself in the eye or get frustrated like I did. Take a script that works, expand on it. Feel free to borrow them, or feel free to just take them and use it however it is, because that's what they're there for. And I didn't do it by myself. I use libraries from other people who have written, and so it's a huge open source community. And the book would not be possible without all these guys' effort. Request library, Paramigo. I don't use Napalm, but it's a great effort by those guys as well. So it's great to see these people coming together. I mean, when you and I first started with automation, it felt lonely, didn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, it felt like we were just the only guys doing it. But nowadays, look at how these guys are working together. Look at this community who's encouraging each other. So it's beautiful.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is what I really liked about your book versus a lot of the others that I've seen is you've got really good examples of code.
Okay.
I mean, it's not just Python. You've also got Ansible, which is great to see.
Yeah, I actually have to fight with the publisher a little bit to get those chapters in, because those are not, I mean, let's be honest, right? Those are not actually Python. Those are like YAML. Yeah, those are Ansible. Those are kind of language, domain-specific terms and languages that's specific to Ansible. But at the end, I'm glad it went in. I'm glad, I won that battle. So hopefully you find those useful. But yeah. So it's kind of funny because I title those as like the Python automation framework, just so I could squeeze that in. But
I'm glad you did.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, it's the content that matters, and hopefully people find it helpful.
Yeah, I think it's really good. I mean, it's like I said when I did the original review, I think it's fantastic to go. Like, you can use this as a reference. It's fantastic to see the examples. So I wanted to ask you as well, Python or Ansible, which one would you start with?
Yeah, I would say Python, and that's coming from a person who attended Ansible Fest for the last 2 years and spoke at Ansible 2018.
Wow.
That go for Python, only because, like I said, it's more broad-based. You could always start with Python and go into DevOps, i.e. Ansible, and go into data science, go into web development, go into all these other different fields that interest you. But for Ansible, it's kind of clearly defined for automation space, right? So I think the usage is a little bit more narrow. So if you're asking this question, my guess is that you're open for both. But for people who needs to know Ansible, they already know they got to know Ansible. So for people who ask that question, I think if you're open for both, equally footing, then go for Python.
Yeah, I think it's just guidance for new people, because one of the problems, it's great that we have all these options today, but it's confusing. So
for sure.
Where do you start? So I would agree with you. I would start with Python. Ansible, I find Ansible sometimes frustrating. I've come from a development background many years ago, and it's nice to be. Well, not that I was a great developer, but anyway, I knew a bit. It's nice to once you can create something yourself and you have that power, it's difficult to, be abstracted too much sometimes. Sometimes it's nice just to do it your own way because it's like clay, you can mold it any way you want. So for my personal preference, I like Python. And it's
Like
interesting that you say that. Go on.
Yeah, no, like you said, right? It's Ferrari versus, I don't know what you said, Honda.
Walking, but I mean, it's the same thing, yeah.
Yeah. So if you could create stuff, it's enormous power, right? It's just amazing.
I think that's the thing, as a network engineer, I like to say you get a box of tools, and that's all you have. Like, okay, what IGP are you going to choose? EIGRP, OSPF, RIP, or ISIS, or basically those are your tools. Whereas with Python, the sky's the limit. You do what you want. Yeah,
I mean, if you listen to Packet Pusher, which is another great podcast for us network engineers, is that and they're right. BGP's been around for tens of years and hasn't changed. Like the same 14 knobs that we use. And let's face it, right? Like people only use the top 5. Your AS prepends, your meds, and your local pref, right? That's all you do. And it's been tens of years that hasn't changed. So for traditional network engineer, who has been stuck with those tools, it's so refreshing to just have this world open wide for you, right? But as you said, it's so important to get the first step right because there's just so many tools. And like I said, I made my fair share of mistakes, right? Like I banged my head on some of these syntaxes of Perl, and then I went to look at, like, for example, the chapters on APIs. I tried out everything. I started Web2Py. I mean, not many people heard about it, right? I started with Web2Py. I try out Django. I try out these other, like Bottle, right? All these other frameworks that people could use, and I finally settled on Flask. So if you were brand new to it and you're open for it, what I'm saying is go try out Flask from somebody who's tried 5 other frameworks and finally decide on Flask. That don't walk all these other paths and land on the same mistakes that I did. So that's I guess part of my small contribution to the community is that these are from my own personal last 7-8 years of making mistakes and finally arriving at something that works. And if you look at the forward by Rich, is that these actually work. We use these scripts every day in production to solve the problems that we saw. I mean, I guess not the exact same because we have to have testing and so on. But these are the scripts that scaled down in order to make it digestible. But they're not that different than what we use every day in production.
Yeah, just so that for guys who don't know what that is, Flask, in very basic terms, a lot of Python examples, and this is another reason why I really like your book. A lot of Python scripts that you see, or a lot of code examples, it's just code. It's not like a GUI. Whereas you actually go to the next level where you say, okay, so we do it scripts, we get the information back from the devices, but now we're going to visualize it in like a GUI interface. So could you just, like in a few minutes, what is Flask? Does it basically allows you to have GUI, is that right?
Yeah, basically. So Flask, not necessarily, but for Flask is just a web framework that it started out with an easy way to build backends for web. So I think one of the most useful was I would probably butcher the technical term, but basically it's a URL routing, right? It's a decorator that you put in front of your function and say matching /index or /root or /Eric/Chou to particular function which returns the HTML page, which you don't have to write yourself. So I think back in the day when I was in college, we actually have to hard code HTML, right? Your HTML slash body slash head or whatnot, and slash HTML that enclosing the whole DOM. But so Flask is a framework that abstracts you away from it. But what ended up happening is that Flask it goes into the philosophy of differences between these Python frameworks. But basically, a lot of people call Flask a micro framework, which is because you could start very, very small, very similar to Python. That you could. I think the first example they did on the Flask tutorial was 8 lines. So for 8 lines of code, you can actually have a displaying a not so beautiful index.html page back to the user. So the philosophy was you could start small and you could do some URL routing, which in our case, we use it for APIs, right? So you got like /router1/interface/1 that you could route to a direct function, and that function would go out and say, use any of the library that would cover in the first 4 chapters, or even Ansible playbook to go out and grab the information and present it as a dictionary back to the user. So Flask is a web framework that is, quote unquote micro, so you could start small, and then add more modules as you see fit, much more like Python importing libraries. So there's a bunch of plugins and modules that will enhance it, as opposed to some of the other frameworks which are great, like Django, that I think quote unquote they're perfectionists with a deadline. That is the audience that they aim for, right? So which means they already have a very opinionated way of talking to databases, opinionated way of how you could use CSS and HTML, right? So if you're interested, go look them up. And I think I got that tag correctly. So these are different opinions, and me personally, for our context, network engineering context, writing APIs, I personally believe Flask is the way to go. So I think that's a long answer for a short question, but that's my opinion.
No, I agree. I mean, it's like you said earlier. You want quick wins.
Yeah.
You want to spend as little time as you can to get as much as you can, and I think Python with Flask will give you that. So I'm really glad you brought that up. So another hard question for you, Eric. I've got both books in front of me here.
Yep.
I was looking at it earlier today just to make sure I was ready for this call, and I think it's like 4, maybe 5 chapters of your first book that you've changed in your second book, revision, or second edition, sorry. So the first book had a focus quite heavily on OpenFlow and sort of SDN.
Yep.
Why the major change?
Yeah, David, it was a sad day when I.
So just so everyone knows, your second book doesn't have OpenFlow in it, does it?
No. Yeah. So it was a sad day when I decided to take out the OpenFlow chapter. So yeah, precisely, it was 10 to 13. So 4 chapters in the first edition was on OpenFlow. So SDN, and then 3 of them were on OpenFlow, which was going from the intros to kind of more advanced, and then it went into some of the projects like Open Daylight, or I think even went into Open Control, whatever it is that
you got Rehu in here as well.
Yeah, and then. Anyways, so 4 chapters on that. But and I was a true believer. If you go on my blog, right, it's timestamp. 2011 was the time when I wrote my blog post about OpenFlow and soft switch and all that stuff.
Oh wow.
So I was a true believer, and for a while that was like ranked number 1 on Google for articles in that category. So I was really a believer, and I continue to be a believer. But at the end of the day, it's about the reader. It's about how much value the reader could get out of it, and what appeals to the majority of people who I think would pick up this book. That's how much value can they apply in their daily job. And let's be honest. I mean, I will ask you right now, like, how many production deployment have you seen that's based on pure OpenFlow?
You don't do it.
Precisely, right? Precisely.
It's great for university projects, but
exactly. And that started out as a university project at Stanford, but yeah. So the simple answer would just be that I think it would be more value for people to know about Git, or to know about Jenkins, to know about AWS networking, than to learn about this OpenFlow 1.3 protocol that negotiates MAC address of your control nodes, right? And we work with Big Switch, early on through the Daemon project, and I continue to to talk to Kyle and some of the other guys at Big Switch, and you would notice that their documentation actually took out OpenFlow, even though they were one of the two companies, Nicira being another one, that are the two early companies that bank their future on OpenFlow. Nowadays, they actually took out OpenFlow from this term OpenFlow on a lot of their documentations, and that's just a sign of the times. So so the reason to take it out was just so that I think people would be more beneficial from the book. Not that I'm not a fan of it. I'm still a big fan of it. There are times I still think about how can we make OpenFlow work in the projects I work on, but those are less and less, almost to zero nowadays. So I hope
see you saying that with a heavy heart, man. Sorry.
Yeah. I truly hoped OpenFlow had taken off just because of the freedom it has. Yeah. But if you compare the first edition and the second edition, if you look at the example, even just to get a MAC address table built, something we all take for granted, right? You plug in a switch and, spanning tree is already there. MAC address, ARPing is still there, but it took lines and lines and lines of code to get just to build a MAC address table, right? Think about it. You have to have a dictionary, some kind of storage to know the source address of that ARP request, and then you got to put the flow down to ARP to all the other ports except the source port, and then you have to keep track of the responses. Then you build that MAC address to complete that first ARP request, right? Or then you do the ARP response. So think about that. Something that we take for granted would take lines and lines of code, and that eventually becomes a kind of the Achilles heel for OpenFlow. It's just too complicated. And unfortunately, that's the way they are. And we should just kind of move on. And like the world is just so great and full of challenges to be stuck on one problem.
So here's the hard question.
Yeah.
I'm new to networking. I'm say CCNA.
Sure.
Should I learn OpenFlow or should I forget about it?
At this point, just forget about it. Unless you work for Google, but you won't work for Google if you just started networking, unless you do something others, right? But I would tell you the only production deployment that I've heard of for pure OpenFlow was Google's WAN network from not SD-WAN, but like the WAN network that has a controller that balances out the flow, and the result is astonishing, right? So if you look at GCP, which is Google Cloud Platform, that their VPC, which is their virtual private. I mean, this gets into a niche a little bit, so feel free to tune out for the last 2 minutes if you want. But if you look at the Google Cloud Platform, their VPC is actually global, and where AWS VCP is regional, right? So think about the difference there. Like you have to create your subnet within the AWS region. For Google, you could create global. And I think that was a result of their OpenFlow deployment because it gave them the ultimate flexibility, the ultimate abstraction of the flow on top of OpenFlow, right? So, but for that difference, would you, if you were the decision maker for say a new Eric's cloud or David's cloud, right? For that little difference, would you go implement OpenFlow? That ultimately becomes the question: is that how useful it is for every day for 99% of the people versus for that 1% that truly makes that difference, but takes like 80% of the effort. So you tell me.
Yeah, I mean, most people don't work for Google. I mean, Google's, I mean, its cloud is great and all, but it's. If you look at a percentage of network engineers, most people don't work for big companies like AWS. Most of us work for SMBs or enterprise perhaps, but at that level it's pointless. So I agree with you. I mean, I say it with a sad heart as well because I also invested a lot of time learning OpenFlow.
I took your course actually. That was the first time that I think you did a lot with HPE, which is I don't even know where they're now, but HPE
that's kind of like
and the controller. Yeah. So we both were believers and we both were kind of turn around our mentality in the sense of for the majority of the people. And what you said just reminded me that take it from me that it's so much better to be the customer of the clouds than to build the cloud. Your wife would thank you for it. Your kids would thank you for it. Your family would see you a lot more, and you would have a lot more sleep under your belt.
That's interesting. Yeah, but I mean, it's great. It's great that you rewrote the book. I mean, how much time was there between the two versions?
It was a 1 year.
It's not long.
So yeah, so it was. I think the first edition was published June 2017, like end of June 2017, and then the second edition came out in September of 2018, end of September, so almost October. So it was about a year. But I didn't really start thinking about it. And part of it was to get feedbacks from the actual readers. So, And by the way, I'm opening this up. Like, feel free to send me tweets or send me LinkedIn messages. People have been doing it, and I appreciate every single one of them to give me feedbacks on, this chapter was hard to follow. And one of the things that I'm sure you could relate to is that feedback from people is super important, right? Yeah. And in the challenge with the book is I don't get the direct feedback from the readers. So I would appreciate all the feedbacks from the readers on different things, like maybe I'm wrong about Django, right? Maybe people have used Django to build APIs and they found it much better than Flask. I welcome that feedback too. And so part of it after the first edition was published was to, kind of talk to my friends, and people have given me feedbacks and I've thought about it. So in January of 2018, luckily, the first edition sold pretty well. And Pack came back and approached me and said, "Did you want to do a second edition?" Despite my better judgment, because it was a labor of love, but it was just really time consuming. Despite my better judgment, I said yes. And then
I'm glad you did it.
Yeah. So
I think the second book is a lot better than the first. Just sorry to interrupt you. Just like you put AWS in, which is great.
Yeah.
Was when I saw your first book, I thought, OpenFlow. It was at that time when it was kind of like, I wonder if OpenFlow is going to last.
Yeah.
And my biggest problem with OpenFlow, and it's the same with my course, it's the same with your book.
Sure.
The criticism is okay. So now what do I do with it? Because I have this beautiful controller and a switch. Okay, and then what's the application? Whereas like with Python and AWS, the applications are very practical. I mean, I can take your book and apply it tomorrow to my environment. So I'm really glad you did that. So thanks.
Yeah, hopefully, there's no, like you said, right? Like OpenFlow, it's kind of this blank canvas where you could paint beautiful brushes on it and beautiful pictures, but there's no guardrail. So like what's next, and even the general direction of, so I think you and I both aware that the biggest challenge for Big Switch and HPE and Nicira, now VMware to a certain extent, is what application can I build on top? What's that killer app?
Exactly.
And they've actually opened it up for like contests and say, like submit this, and then the first place will win X amount of prize and so on. But that never came about, right? We all patiently waited for 2-3 years, and that killer app never came about. So so I'm glad you like the second edition, and I'm opening up right now to say anybody who have a second suggestion for the third edition, let me know, right? Like answer in the YouTube comments below. I will read every single one of them. If it takes days, I will read them. So please.
I was going to say, Eric, I should have said this in the beginning, but I'll put your contact information below the video. So if anyone wants to get hold of you, just give us your Twitter handle, LinkedIn, everything, so guys can contact you directly or put in the comments below. But I mean, that'd be great. I mean, it's I think I really like the second edition. OpenFlow, same as you. I've been through that. I agreed. So I'm glad it's hard to say, but I'm glad that you said it.
Awesome. I'm it's good to have a secondary opinion. Like I said, like this was just my own personal opinion, so it's good to know that another industry veteran agrees with me, who's as heavily invested in OpenFlow, if not more than me. So take it from us.
I agree 100%. So Eric, I've gone over our time, so apologies for
Okay.
that, but it's been
No
really
worries.
good. Is there
Yeah, it's
anything
great.
else you want to say before we wrap up the call?
Um, No, just to get started, right? Like, I mean, like I said, I don't really make money from the book, and the aim really is just to offer people benefits, and I want to lead with value, right? So hopefully it's available to you. You know, if I could make it like sell for $10, I would, but
Yeah,
it's not up to me for the price.
yeah,
So it's available on Safari. It's available on a lot of platforms, and like such as Pack. So you could have a trial period for Pack from their subscription service that 7 days for 30 days or 7 days for free. So you could read it for free, and Safari offers trial period, and obviously, so hopefully it brings value to people. And again, that is my kind of my mission, is just that share my experience, and hopefully it makes your life easier. And if it does that, then I'm glad. I am really glad that if it just helps somebody out there to go home at 5:30. Like, if we think back on the experience, just that one script that help you to go home that one day instead of 4 hours, then it's worth it.
no, I agree. No, I really appreciate you putting all the effort in. I mean, it's amazing what a book can do, because it's like in your example, it's years and years and years of frustration and hassle, and you've put all the hard work in and been through all the frustration, and then you can distill it into a book to save us a lot of time. So yeah, really appreciate you putting that effort in, and thanks for writing the book.
Yeah, no, David, thanks for having me. Like I said, I've been a fan for a long time.
Appreciate it.
It's great to be here and to reach. I think your audience is precisely who could potentially benefit the book. So thanks for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation, and
No, it was great.
glad to be here.
Hopefully I can convince you to do another one.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the intent is there. The physical time might not be, but the intent
Yeah,
will
that's the
definitely be
problem. Yeah.
there.
So
Yeah.
Eric, I just want to say thanks very much. Really appreciate you taking all this time, and really appreciate you, writing the book. And thanks for the Christmas giveaway, for giving away some copies. I really appreciate it, and we look forward to, your third edition, or what the other books that you've written. So really
Yeah,
appreciate
feedbacks,
it.
please. Feedbacks. Thank you. Thanks, David. Thanks.
Great. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Cheers.